I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to continue our study of the New England colonies, looking at how political and religious changes in England are going to filter through and affect the development of our friends, the Puritans of New England. Here are our objectives for today. Take a brief moment to pause and copy them down, and then let's dive back into our narrative. So, as you hopefully remember, the colonies of both Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay were settled by Puritans, with the goal being to establish a place in which they could worship freely, which hopefully you remember from previous lessons differs to some degree from the story of religious freedom. But in general, these colonies were able to thrive, and based upon both good planning, to some degree luck, and significant resources, they were able to establish thriving colonies and push the Native Americans sort of out of the areas that they were planning on settling. Within about a decade, you started to see the population of Massachusetts Bay expand significantly. And more, we had talked previously about how settlements along the southern coast and political differences led to the founding of both the Rhode Island and Connecticut colonies, whereas up along the Atlantic coast, eventually we saw Puritans move up and found what is eventually going to become New Hampshire. Eventually, they broke off from the Massachusetts Bay colony and established their own sort of charter and government, but they're Puritans, and so they've got a lot of the same beliefs and structures, town hall meetings, all that sort of stuff, that our other Puritans have. All of these societies, in order to keep their Puritan nature as they economically grew, established laws like the Massachusetts Colony Sumptuary Laws, which states that, quote, "It is therefore ordered by the court that no person within the jurisdiction nor any of their relations shall not exceed the true and indifferent value of 200 pounds and shall wear any gold or silver lace or gold or silver buttons or any bone lace over two shillings per yard, or silk hooves or scarves, under the penalty of 10 shillings. And for every such offense and every such delinquent shall be presented to the grand jury. And it is further ordered by the authorities aforesaid that the selectmen of every town are entitled or required to take regard and notice of the apparel of the inhabitants." And so what we clearly see here is they are establishing a code of conduct by which they're preventing people from dressing in fancy clothing or doing other things, wearing silk buttons or silver buttons or bone lace, or other things that members of the elect wouldn't do. We remember, of course, that the Puritans are Calvinists, and so they need to behave as members of the elect would behave. And clearly, members of the elect would not be wearing such luxurious things as silk hoods or scarves. Right about this time period, in England, the first English civil wars had just come to a close, and Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan cronies had taken over England itself. So, with Puritans now in control of England, Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan associates started trying to turn England into the Puritan utopia, similar to the way that the colonists were attempting to, similar to the world that the colonists were attempting to create in New England. And so, although on the one hand this is positive for the Puritans because the leadership in England now supports their religious mission, whereas before, it was Puritans fleeing from Anglican persecution, all of a sudden now it's Anglicans, Presbyterians, Quakers, all these other groups of people who are now fleeing England from Puritan persecution. Because, of course, the Puritans banned all the fun stuff Puritans always ban, your festivals, your theater, your holidays, banned Christmas, banned drinking, banned all of that sort of stuff. And so, whereas previously New England was a haven for Puritans, now it's starting to get an influx of non-Puritans into their society. This becomes somewhat problematic for the Puritans because, as we remember, they're trying to create a perfect religious utopian community with only Puritans there. And so, what happens when a bunch of non-Puritans start flooding into their society? Well, it's going to clearly corrupt them, and it's going to lead to tension unless they find some way to come up with a settlement. Because clearly all of these people who are fleeing from Puritan rules in England are not going to be willing to quietly accede to Puritan rules in New England. So, what's the answer? It's this thing called the Halfway Covenant. In Puritan society, as you remember, you had to be a member of the church in good standing in order to vote and participate in the town hall meetings. So as a larger percentage of the population of these New England towns became non-Puritan, all of a sudden you get this whole group of people who are not members of the church in good standing, and are being locked out of government. The way to get around this is to come up with a series of rules that those people should follow. So, quote, "These things are required for all church members: repentance from sin and faith in Jesus Christ. And they must profess and demonstrate these in such a way as to satisfy rational charity that they are genuinely present and honest in their dealings." And so whereas Puritans needed to have this complex religious conversion narrative in order to be accepted into the church, these sort of halfway Puritans only had to promise to be what's, quote, "a visible saint in public," which means that they can't go around sinning or breaking all the Puritan society rules. The Puritans aren't going to be digging into their sort of private lives as much as they would a member of the full church. But as long as they're, dressing the part, acting the part, and not, going around and getting drunk in public or committing adultery or things like that, you could become a halfway member of the church by behaving as a visible saint and still participate in Puritan society. For a lot of Puritans, though, this was really problematic, and so they decided to go out and look for what was destroying their society, because for Puritans, giving in to members and allowing members who are not members of the elect to participate is sort of destroying the religious mission. And so they cast around to try to figure out who was responsible, and they decided witches. And so we got a huge uptick in witch trials as the Puritans tried to find the witches responsible for the destruction of their society and punish them, generally with death or, with some other horrific punishment. The witch trials happened all across New England. In the aftermath of these witch trials, a lot of the Puritans, especially in Connecticut, tried to suppress a lot of the data and the stories about these, having been somewhat embarrassed by the number of witches that they tried. But it should be known that most Puritan societies did try at least some witches in order to try to stop the corruption of their society. And the Puritans sort of blaming witches for things going wrong is pretty common throughout the early history of New England. And so the effect of this is pretty straightforward. Quote, "Slowly but surely a process of secularization began to take place, and before the end of the first century of American Congregationalism, a democratization of its churches was evident in the obliteration of the distinction between saints of the visible congregation and members of the parish at large, both groups now having a voice in church government." And so we see a breaking of the power of the Puritan church and a gradual lessening of the religiosity of New England. As these communities grew, and as travel between England and the colonies was disrupted by both the Second and the Third English Civil Wars, the Puritans decided that they needed to start training their own officials, and so they created some of their own universities. Harvard University, established just outside of Boston, was the first university established in the colonies, although Yale College in Connecticut would quickly be established after. Both of these colleges were originally set up to purely train ministers, but eventually they started bringing in more people from a variety of started training people in other fields. And New England became a center of higher education, which it still continues to be to this day. All of this combined with the Puritans' universal mandated public education, led Puritan society to be one of the most literate societies in the world at this time. And it's going to lead to a lot of the foremost thinkers of the American Revolution coming out of New England because of this long history of education and a focus on education and higher learning. The economy of the New England colonies was relatively mixed. As the population grew, of course, more people got involved in a variety of different things beyond farming. And so fishing, of course, was always very large, was always very prominent. Also, of course, the harvesting of whales for whale oil for lamps and industrial lubrication and things like that. We also got some people farming livestock. There was significant shipping, as there were a number of very good ports in New England, so it became a center of trade. and a number of the most wealthy people in Massachusetts are going to be merchants, which is sort of very unlike the wealthy farmers of the southern colonies. And then again, you get a large shipbuilding and timber industry as the colonists systematically harvested the large forests of New England in order to fuel their growing society and growing economy. So shipbuilding, whaling, and all of these things became important industries. But of course, farming was also essential just for the day-to-day life and to feed the small villages and communities. All of this connected New England into the larger triangular trade, and many of the largest cities in the colonies started to grow up both in New England and then, of course, also in the middle colonies, which we'll be talking about for tomorrow. The southern colonies never really developed those large cities because of the rural sort of plantation-based nature of at least the upper class of society. And in general, you see how the triangular trade connects into New England and how New England had a variety of different crafts that they were into. The other big business ends up being rum production, as molasses from the Caribbean is brought up north to New England, where it is distilled into rum, which is then sold as a luxury good both to the colonists themselves, but then also, of course, across the ocean in Europe. All of this expansion eventually led Puritans to again crash into the remaining Native American tribes of the region. A Native American chief named Metacom began to build a multinational Native coalition to try to fight back against the Puritans. The Puritans called him King Philip for some reason, so this war is known as King Philip's War. Metacom and his troops struck probably close to a third of the New England villages, destroying a number of them, and pushing the Puritans almost to the brink of annihilation. When the Puritans were able to fight back, Metacom himself was killed in a Puritan ambush, and after Metacom's death, the rest of the coalition fell apart. The Native Americans stopped working together effectively, and Puritan forces were able to launch a substantial counterattack, finally driving the Native American peoples out of New England for good. At this point, the population of the Native Americans in New England really bottoms out, and then by 1750, there are very, very few Native Americans left. Here's a dramatization of King Philip getting beaten to death by a musket for some reason. And you can see that after this point, after King Philip's War, the Puritan population is going to skyrocket. And so that's the story of the development of the New England colonies and how they grew from these small, sort of isolated villages who were designed to be religious utopias for these religious purists, grew into a very large and urban mercantile trading network that is going to be the economic backbone of the English colonies in North America. So here are your objectives for today. Hopefully you're able to answer them. And for tomorrow, we'll bring the middle colonies onto our map and talk our way through the variety of different people and places that establish the rest of our 13 colonies. Thank you for listening.